Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to hand it over to our Matriarchs co-curator, Kristen Dorsey.
Thanks, Holly. Chokma, Chin Chokma, Kristen Dorsey, Sa Hilchifo. Thank you all so much for coming to attend tonight. We're really excited to have you and to welcome you to this conversation. And I'm really excited and thankful that ESMoA was able to host an event like this, because I think it is so important to understand and learn our Indigenous history of this land. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that we are on occupied Tongva lands. It's important to know whose land you're on and who those people are, and that they have a vibrant, thriving community today. And I would like to welcome our guests that we are really fortunate to have join us, and we thank them for their time and their knowledge tonight. Desireé Martinez is a Gabrielino Tongva member, and she is the co-director of the Pima Catalina Island Archaeological Project. She is also an archaeologist at Cogstone Resource Management, and she has dedicated her career to preserving sacred cultural sites, especially those of her Tongva community. So we're very thankful to have Desireé with us tonight. And then Dr. Shannon Speed is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and she is the director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. She's worked for the past 2 decades in Mexico, and her research has been focused on Mexico for the past 2 decades. And her interests include Indigenous politics, legal anthropology, human rights, neoliberalism, gender, Indigenous migration, and activist research. She's also published 5 books and edited volumes about these topics. And it's also, I'd also like to add that she received a prestigious award from our tribe, the Dynamic Woman of the Year Award, which I think is amazing. So thank you, Dr. Shannon Speed, for being with us tonight. And then I will open up the floor to these 2 ladies to take us through this conversation. Chukmashki.
Meiha, everybody. Which that means welcome, hello in Gabrielino Tongva, and I'm really excited to be here, and I'm actually quite overwhelmed to be surrounded by such beautiful women pictured on these walls. And I was out in the vestibule, and they say, you know, take a ribbon and celebrate a matriarch in your family, and I'm gonna put one for my grandmother who passed 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago. So now I'm getting emotional for some reason. And a lot of that has to do with what we're discussing today in terms of Thanksgiving. And we're going to talk about the origins and the myth, but then also talk about how contemporary Native American communities actually celebrate the holiday, but for different reasons. But I wanted to welcome you all here and thank you for being caretakers of my beautiful land, and if you're not, then start caretaking for it. But I definitely am honored to be here and quite thankful to be invited to talk to you all today. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Speed.
Chokma, Hashlaka Chokma, Sahal Chifoat Ihoitana, Chikashasaya, Chatasaya. Hi everyone. My Chickasaw name is Ihoitana. My name is Shannon Speed. I'm Choctaw and Chickasaw by descent, and I'm a Chickasaw citizen. I'm very honored to be with you tonight. I really appreciate the invitation. My good friend Kristen, very honored to be able to be here with you. So, and it's a great honor, of course, to be here with Desireé. So, at a recent meeting of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, they had a panel that was the name of the panel in the session was Shut Up, Osages Are Speaking, and which I just loved. So I'm going to say shut up and let the Tongva speak, because we're on Tongva land. Back to you.
So one of the things I have for you guys is a handout, and so everybody's always asking for resources. And I had the opportunity when I was doing my graduate work at Harvard to work with a lot of Wampanoag community members who are the original people out on Cape Cod, as well as Martha's Vineyard. And so they worked with Plymouth Plantation in order to put together this book, which is called 1621, A New Look at Thanksgiving. And so a lot of what we think about in terms of Thanksgiving is a myth and is a history that does not include an Indigenous perspective. And so I've copied 2 pages from this book, and then of course the cover, so in case you want to go out and buy it, it's geared toward elementary school children to age 12, but it's still an awesome resource. And what's really great about it is that if any of you have never been to Plymouth Plantation, it's a reconstruction of what Plymouth colony would have looked like in the 1600s. And they got a lot of grief because previous to the 1990s, they would have very stereotypical discussions about Wampanoag culture, etc. And so they created a Native American village in order to provide better interpretation about Native American perspectives, including reaching out to the Wampanoags in order to get their perspective about what actually happened, and that's kind of the result of this book. And so there's really great, one of the things that I hate when you talk about the past is you'll get these really crazy illustrations that, of course, then go to stereotypical clothing, et cetera, and looks. And the people that are photographed in this book are actually Wampanoag community members, both from Mashpee as well as Gayhead, as well as other New England Native American community members. And so they acted out the first Thanksgiving, or should I say, it was kind of like a week-long celebration of gatherings. And so it really puts a better face on what we're talking about today. So, if you want to come and look at this afterwards, but I have those 2 pages so that, this is a really a great resource. But one of the big things that I really want to stress, and I've had conversations with other Indigenous people about this. Again, when I went to school, one of the things that always happened was that there was protests at Plymouth Rock during Thanksgiving in order to talk about these myths and stuff like that. But one of the big things, particularly with a lot of Native communities, one, we're not all the same. Each tribe and community and village had their own ceremonies and gatherings, et cetera. But across the nation, there was always some type of celebration of the harvest, celebration both in terms of the social sense, but also in the ceremonial sense. For the Gabrielino Tongva, we are connected to the earth, we're connected to the air, we're connected to the water, we're connected to the rocks. We have a relationship that we need to acknowledge because we wouldn't be here without everything that surrounds us. And so when I was talking about how Thanksgiving was important in my family, it had nothing to do with pilgrims and Indians coming together all those years and stuff like that. It always began and ended with family, coming together to celebrate the highs and the lows and seeing people that we hadn't seen because my family's scattered everywhere. And so that's what I want to ground this conversation in is that amongst all of our communities, there was always that type of gathering. There was always that type of acknowledgement of, I don't want to say nature, but those ancestors that are around us and those relatives that are around us. And I think that's one of the most important things I think we need to think about when we're trying to reinterpret what Thanksgiving is and means to us as a community, both the Tongva community and the community that's here present today.
I think that's so important. The things, so, we're the Debbie Downer people that are like here to tell you what's wrong with your holiday. And I guess it's really important to depart from the fact that, this kind of gathering existed on this continent long before European arrival. And what the concerns that Native people have about it are about the ways that it has been ideologically constructed in ways that erase the real history of the way that this country was created, right? And so, you know, last year, a year ago, LA City and County both voted to eliminate Columbus Day in the city and county and establish in its place as a holiday, as a paid holiday, and establish in its place Indigenous Peoples Day. And one of the reasons that they did that, and what the council members, the LA City council members explicitly said, was that you know, they wanted to right a historical wrong. I mean, they wanted to stop pretending about our history, right, and acknowledge the history that is there, that's important for our city and our county to acknowledge the real history of what happened. They also said, and I think this is important, that they wanted to eliminate an ongoing harm because Indigenous people are still here, right? So I don't know how many people know this, but California has the largest American Indian population of any state. We have over 100 tribes. 700,000 Native people in the state. LA County has 73,000 Native people. That makes Los Angeles the largest Indigenous city in the country. And you know, of course, we have 5.2 million Native Americans across the country. So those living people experience Thanksgiving as a harm, right? Because it erases our history and because it inscribes an ideological history that's damaging for our people. And so I think the elimination of Columbus Day, I think, you know, you could draw parallels to Thanksgiving, and I'm not suggesting that we should eliminate Thanksgiving, but rather rethink it in a way that might be more healthful for our communities.
Now it's back to me, okay. So, you know, one of the big things, and this is what we're trying to do. Actually, in case you didn't know, there's a Columbus statue in Grant Park in downtown LA. It is being removed on Saturday. So if you're free, please go down and help us celebrate that statue coming down, and it's going to be replaced by a statue that is based on the great-granddaughter of one of our elders, Julia Bogany. And so, you know, it's not going to happen tomorrow, on Saturday, but it's going to be in the works. So the fact that I think it's really important, you know, the history of the United States, right? Everybody knows that the history is written by the victors. And the suffering, the pain, Debbie Downers, that's what we're going to do today. You know, the suffering and the pain of not only Indigenous communities, but all immigrant communities that helped build this nation. You know, the Chinese with the railroads and Mexican-American community members who are actually, you know, harvesting our food. We forget the pain and the suffering that they had to deal with in order to, you know, to build our nation. But it's really important to acknowledge those ancestors. And so that's one of the things that's why, again, I love this exhibit, because not only are you seeing, you know, these matriarchs and these women who are very strong within our communities, but we're also giving honor to all of those that came before us. And that's one of the things that I do with my life, is making sure that my ancestors continue to be buried, and that if they're not, if they're out on shelves on museums, that they become reburied, because that's the way you honor your ancestors, is you make sure that their journey is complete. And so we do a disservice to those people that came before us by not knowing the truth and the origins of the stories that we hold dear. And it's great and it's nice to put on little plays and you know, dress up and celebrate during holidays, but if you're not doing it by understanding what really happened, you are, you know, dishonoring those people. And it's not just Indigenous people, but, you know, there are people who are descended from the original settlers in Plymouth. And, you know, we just need to make sure that, you know, the stories that we're telling is true and that we're honoring them. So do you want to go a little bit about the origins?
Sure. Before I forget, though, I want to say that the statue's being taken down, in case anybody wants to be there. The statue's being taken down at 10 a.m. in Grant Park. And that was a product of community struggle, but again, an acknowledgement of the fact that creates an ongoing harm. And I suggested a minute ago that it's an ongoing harm for Indigenous people, but one of the big things that City Council made clear, and that all the Native peoples who came forward to give their testimony about Columbus Day made clear, is that, it's not just harmful for, and Thanksgiving, that Thanksgiving ideology isn't just harmful for Indigenous people, it's harmful for everyone. It's harmful for everyone in this country not to acknowledge and wrestle with the problematic issues in our history. So I think that's really important. And, I did want to mention that since 1970, I believe, there's a counter Thanksgiving that takes place. It's called the Day of Mourning, that takes place at Plymouth, and a lot of people go out from around the country to be at that protest. And they have an interesting website if you want to take a look at it. But I think we could talk about. I'm on the program as talking about the history of Thanksgiving, and I'm not a historian, and I don't specialize in Thanksgiving. I'm actually an anthropologist, and so I'm kind of interested in the holiday as a cultural artifact. But I do teach a little bit about it in my Intro to American Indian Studies class, and so there's just a couple points that I try to make in those classes about what is problematic in the way we've rewritten history. So, we have the kind of traditional Thanksgiving story, the Pilgrims came, kind of refugees seeking political and religious freedom, and were struggling to stay alive. Friendly Wampanoag people helped them through a rough winter, and they had a harvest festival to celebrate that. And some elements of that story are true. That's not a complete falsehood, but there's a lot of important information that isn't included in the way that story gets told, right? And so, part of that is that a lot of Europeans had been here before the Pilgrims, right? So the main person who aided the Pilgrims is called Squanto. His real name was, what was his real name? Is Squan. What was? No, he was chief. Is this Squant?
Let me look in my book.
Squantum. I'm sure it's in there. Squanto was like an anglicization of his name.
Remember how to pronounce it.
But the reason he was the main person who helped them was because he spoke English. Well, how did this guy speak English? Well, guess what? Europeans who had been here earlier had enslaved him, sent him off to Spain as a slave. He managed to escape
Tisquantum,
slavery.
sorry.
Tisquantum. And he escaped from slavery in Spain. He ended up in England, where he learned English very fluently, managed to make his way back to his homeland, where he found that his entire village had died of disease that was brought by the Europeans. So he was living with other. Wampanoag was actually a confederacy of tribes, so it was a mix of people. So he was living with a different tribe than his own within the Wampanoag. And so, none of that history of European enslavement or, the spread of disease that was brought by Europeans is talked about. So the Wampanoag, at the time that the Pilgrims had their harvest fest in 1621, had already lost, they estimate, up to 90% of their population to disease and enslavement. So European arrival had a tremendous impact on them. And one of the reasons that they were friendly with the Pilgrims was precisely that other indigenous groups were putting pressure on them because their numbers were so greatly reduced already. So that doesn't get told. What also doesn't get told is that, 15 years later, when the Massachusetts government declares a day of Thanksgiving, he does so to celebrate the massacre of 600 unarmed people, indigenous people, right? And so that became the day of Thanksgiving. It was established as a federal holiday by Abraham Lincoln, and that was shortly after he ordered what remains to this day the largest mass state-sponsored killing, which was of 38 Lakota men, which took place shortly. He gave that order 2 days after signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's a very problematic history there. After all of this happened, European incursion into the Southeast caused removal, and to the west, and eventually we have the reservation system, we have boarding schools, we have forced assimilation, we have in California coming out of missionization, we then have some extremely genocidal policies of the state government where they were actually paying people to go out and kill off the Indians. This is following the gold rush in the last half of the 19th century. And so we could talk more about any of those things, but that's a history. So in many ways, Plymouth, you could see how for Native people, the celebration of Plymouth is like celebrating the launching point of a genocide, right, of our people. And so that's what creates the ongoing harm. And I think in this country, most people I teach Intro to American Indian Studies, and here's an example of how it harms people to not be truthful about our country's history. My students are enraged. They are enraged when they find out what they haven't been taught. And they say, what else have they lied to us about? I mean, they feel, that their entire public school education is like a fraud for them. They question everything, and that we're doing them a disservice by putting them in that position, right? And if they didn't happen to have taken an American Indian Studies class, probably because it fit their schedule and not because they actually had any interest in it, they might have never learned this history, right? And so, anyway, this is why I think it's important for us for this country to be grappling with its history.
I think a lot of, it's not just Thanksgiving, but any type of holiday that has some type of Native American component, thinking about Columbus Day and thinking about all of these kind of other holidays, looking at how they developed, it's all, and I talked a little bit about this, it's all about stereotypes, right? So we think about the peaceful Native American, that they're, welcoming, that you get this image of the stoic Indian who has a stiff upper lip and very honored, and I've actually taken pictures myself, looking into the sky, looking very, Indian and stoic, my earrings and stuff, like I've done that too. But, when we start, unpackaging all of these ideas of what Native people are, a lot of that is a result of the death of our communities. And you are left with the poor, pitiful Indians begging on the street corners. A lot of people don't know that we actually had slave auctions in downtown LA of Native American community members that were rounded up because they were drunk in the streets. And they were put in jail on the weekends, and in order to get bailed out, the ranchers would come and bail them out, and they would work for the rancher for a week, and they'd be paid in alcohol. And so on the weekend, they're drunk again, and then rounded up and put into jail. And a lot of people don't realize that. So when you see these images, there's always the good Indian and the bad Indian. I always use Dances with Wolves. Like, I love Dances with Wolves because there was a lot of Indigenous actors there. But you had the bad Pawnee, they were evil, and then you had the Lakota, which were the good Indians. And, there's these dichotomies of good and bad and stoic and, pitiful. And that's not the case. Like, in some instances, in our history, we had to live through massacres, we had to live through death, we had to live through not having money and scraping by, et cetera. But that's also a story of all peoples, depending on how you grew up and stuff like that. But a lot of these stories are created in order to make our painful history palatable. We are Debbie Downers, but that's the truth of the history, and we have to confront it and acknowledge it. And not that I'm blaming any of you here, but we have to, again, understand that our ancestors made choices, not necessarily good or bad per se, but we are the result of those choices, and we have to acknowledge that. And then understand that these images that are out there are, like, if anybody's watched Peter Pan, the cartoon, recently, and it's like, how did the Indians become red, and these really horrible racist songs and stuff like that. Like, we have to confront our racist history and then create a new image that's truthful about our different communities. And again, I keep pointing to this exhibit, but the pictures here are so, and the art here is so different from what we usually see, and which is usually celebrated about our Indigenous communities. That's the kind of a story that needs to be told, that it shouldn't be these images based on Plains Indians from the 18th century that are totally outmoded and outdated. We were and continue to be a diverse community with different cultural traditions, different ways of of interacting with the environment around us, different ways of living, different houses, different cultural traditions, et cetera. And that's, over 500 tribes, that's the beauty of who we are, and we'd rather have that image of the beautifulness of our community celebrated as opposed to these static, glorified stereotypes that get passed down.
So I would love to have this be a dialogue. I meant to say at the beginning that we would like you to raise your hand and ask questions at any time as we're talking and not have it be kind of just us up here talking, but does anyone have questions or comments?
Oh, and I also just wanted to jump in, Shannon, that if you do have a question, I'll be bringing the mic around to you. This is just to help with hearing and for anyone who might have a difficult time. So if you have your question and raise your hand, please wait till I get the mic to you.
Could you recommend organizations or places around LA where we can continue to have information unfold and good places to go to learn more?
Do you want to talk about Mila?
Yeah, so on the Gabrielino Tongva community, as well as a number of other Southern California tribes and other indigenous groups who call Southern California home, have been working with UCLA with the Mapping Indigenous LA project. So in short, we call it MILA. And what it is a online resource in which to tell our stories, or should I say, the indigenous people who call Los Angeles home tell about their stories and what we want to share. And so the Gabrielino Tongva have one that we talk about the various villages that we want to point out and think are important. And part of that are teaching resources. So right now, there's a couple of links on there under teaching resources, but we're going to be, we're working with one of our community members who unfortunately is sick right now. But we've gathered over 1,000 curricula and materials that are out there, and we're evaluating them for you, so you can know which ones are the good ones in order to use. So, keep an eye on that. And the map that we have, like I said, there's a number of different villages and a number of different places that you can go and visit. One of them happens to be Pavungna, which is our sacred a place of emergence, and it's actually on the campus of Cal State Long Beach, as well as Rancho Los Alamitos in the Long Beach area. And one of our community members actually does third grade curricula and does little tours and stuff like that. Recently, last weekend, we were going to have an Indigenous walk celebrating Tongva history in downtown LA. Unfortunately, we had to postpone it, but keep in mind on that, we'll probably end up doing it early next year. So you can register, and it's limited right now to 25 people. But we're going to have walks like that, and it's really important to go to places and participate in events like that are run by the indigenous community. Unfortunately, there are some people who go out and try to create or recreate the history, but don't talk to the community. So I'm always one for attending events and or places that are interpreted by Native community members, because you can hear from their own mouths what their history is and how they come at it. And then in some instances, I get a lot of people when I talk about how a lot of our sacred and cultural sites are destroyed, of how you can help. So that's a really good resource and place to go.
Yeah, what's really cool about MILA, the Mapping Indigenous Los Angeles project, is that, it's interesting that Los Angeles is the largest indigenous city in the country, but nobody thinks of it as such. People always look at me blankly and go, well, what about Arizona? That people don't perceive it that way. The indigenous population of Los Angeles is largely invisible in this cityscape, and so the map kind of renames the places with indigenous place names and really kind of brings the Native people forward and places them on the landscape. And so I think it's a really beautiful project.
How's it going? Hi. You had mentioned earlier, you touched the history with children in schools. And I'm Lakota and Chippewa. And I remember when my kids were in school, 4th grade, they were teaching the missions. And I'm just curious, I don't know if they're still doing that. And how, and I was honored that one of the teachers, she decided that year to teach ranchero life, where they were farming, and she abolished the whole mission curriculum in her class after that. But that was just one little step. But in this book that you mentioned too, the 1621. See, I don't even know the year. But is that in the schools now? How do we go about grassroots getting those in the schools? Any suggestions?
Grassroots, I don't know about. Maybe Des has some suggestions on that. I wanted to mention that there is legislation in California that is mandating ethnic studies curriculum, and a number of Native people will be working. There's a coalition that's formed to develop that curriculum for the schools, because it could end up being really random if it isn't handled in the right way. So there's Native folks that are working on that. So we're hopeful that, over the next few years, some better materials, better curricula will be integrated into the public education system. I think California is, hopefully stepping away from the 4th grade mission project, which has been so characteristic for so long in California, since I was a kid.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been working with actually with UCLA and Project History X is providing in-service education for teachers. And so last summer, or this summer, and actually last summer as well, I participated in workshops which focused on Tongva history. So we actually had our community members come in and talk about various aspects of Tongva history, so that it could then be, the teachers can then go back to their classes and teach and use the resources, again, that the community deems as being truthful and accurate. So it is kind of a classroom by classroom basis right now. If you want to provide, Deborah Miranda is a really great Native scholar who wrote Bad Indians, and that's a really great book that talks about how horrible the mission curriculum is, and actually talks about the real history of the effects of missionization on Southern California, well, not even just Southern California, but all of California Indians. So if you want to purchase that book and provide it to a 4th grade teacher, because she talks about different activities you can do in order to understand what actually happened. So my nephew just is now in 5th grade, so 4th grade, we were talking about missions. And so I sent him with all of these different books and stuff like that for the teachers. But instead of building a mission, they actually build a traditional house of a California Indian tribe of their choice. And so I helped him, do the research on that, and they built a little 3D model of a house, right? So you want to learn about the people. You learn about the effects of missionization, but you're celebrating the people of who they are and how they lived, as opposed to building little death traps. My niece had previously also had to do a mission, but she ended up putting little dead Indians under tombstones, to talk about. I mean, that's the truthfulness of how many ancestors died because of the mission. And so you can do it, but right now there isn't this huge. It has to be grassroots, and it is really classroom by classroom of getting that history. Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda.
Did she get referred to the school counselor?
No, she didn't.
Psychological counselor.
No, I remember with my sister's 10 years younger than me, and we went on a tour of San Juan Capistrano, and so I was 18, come back from college and stuff like that. So I had my own 4 little kids, and we're looking at the mission self-guided tour. So I started talking about the death and the destruction and all this other kind of stuff. And of course it was really, I don't know how I was saying it, but one of the mothers came and how do you know this is true? I'm like, okay, here, let me tell you what happened. I had to educate, the parents that were there about what the true history is. You're going to visit a mission, you're visiting a death trap. Let's talk about, the death and the destruction and stuff like that. But yeah, it has to be grassroots, and you have to continue to do it, and it's hard. I've had friends who are on boards of charter schools, and they're, you know, and they fight to have the Indigenous voice in all aspects, not just missions or anything like that. But as soon as her kids are out and she's off the board, they go right back to, you know, the old ways of learning. You would think that they would think, okay, let's continue to have real live Native people talk about their history and sing and dance and, you know, that kind of stuff. And it doesn't happen. It's continuously putting the pressure on school districts to think about a different way of teaching this history. It's sad, and it's hurtful, but that's something that we shouldn't shy away from.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be right back. I'll be next.
I have two things. One is I'm always wishing a place like Yosemite would have placards all over the park telling you what would have taken place in this area by the Native people instead of just a museum with a sample of a home and sample of the clothes, or Nature Conservancy in Palos Verdes, anywhere. It seems like the push for what took place in these areas so that people's minds would be reminded constantly. The second thing that I wanted to say was that I went to the Smithsonian and I asked at the information booth in the Native American Museum where was the exhibit on genocide, and the woman said she didn't know what I was talking about. And so I said, you know, and so I explained, and she says, I still don't know what you're talking about. So I asked him in the bookstore, and he said at the Smithsonian, we're not allowed to use that word. It's forbidden, according to 2 people I talked to. So I did find an exhibit, and he said, you must be referring to the Broken Treaty exhibit. That's the only exhibit we have. So it was very interesting that it seems, and of course this is 2 people, I didn't do research, that it's still not by our National Museum, the Smithsonian, allowed to use that word according to 2 different workers. So.
Interesting.
Well, one of the things, you know, as much as I love interpretive signs, they're signs. They're 2-dimensional. Well, technically they're 3-dimensional. I'm always one about talking to the people and having the people talk about themselves and their history. That you learn a lot more, you know, as much as, actually I participated in a discussion at Whittier College last week about digital humanities and using digital resources in order to teach about history in general, right? And so mapping Indigenous LA, we talked about that. But you lose something when you're looking at a computer, when you're looking at a sign, when you're not actually talking to people. And we do have videos of community members, you know, talking about our places on Mila, but you, again, lose something with the video. And, you know, we do and should acknowledge the Indigenous history in different ways, but I don't necessarily think that plaques are it. I have issues with the National Museum of American Indian. I was actually there when it first opened. They had a community day, and one of the exhibits, which they have now closed and they are redoing, had a wall of guns. So a clear plexiglass with a wall of all the different types of guns that were used from colonial times to the end of the Indian Wars, and a wall of Bibles. All the different Bibles, some of them in Indigenous languages. And the reason of the museum was to tell our story and our Native American story and history in different ways. But to be confronted with a wall, I mean, a huge wall of guns, and not talk about genocide, right? I don't even remember the labels. There was like little small labels, and they really didn't talk about why you had guns on display. Because again, that does harm, that does trauma. That's telling only a portion of the story and not telling all of it. And I was actually just recently at the National Museum of American Indian last December with my mom, who loved it, by the way, because we never get to see our history, our Native history, in a museum, you know, a huge museum like that. But I had never heard that they weren't using genocide in their interpretations.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate why that would be. I mean, but I know that, and I have my problems with the museum as well, but I know that one thing that they've tried to do is, represent Native peoples in all of our diversity as we are today, right? So kind of like keeping it on a positive, look, we're contributing a lot, we're doing a lot. This isn't just a Debbie Downer history that we're going to beat you over the head with for now and forever, right? But rather, let's celebrate where Native people are today and what we're doing today. And so that may be tied in with that kind of logic, I'm not sure. I wanted to recommend a book by a colleague of mine, Ben Madley, that is on, it's called An American Genocide, and it's about California. It's basically about the genocidal policies of the California state in the second half of the 19th century. It's very, very well documented. He's a historian. It's won many awards, and the governor, brought him up to give a talk to folks from the legislature, and for the first time, a governor of California acknowledged genocidal practices in the state. So it's a great resource if you're interested, particularly in California history.
Thank you. I work in the field of addiction, and one of the things that is clearly missing is culturally competent treatment programs. And I only know of one, and I'm wondering whether or not you have access to resources, and whether or not there's a collective where people with addiction issues can get care.
I know that there are a couple of organizations in Los Angeles that direct Native peoples to social services, including kind of mental health services and addiction recovery services, but I don't know what the programs are specifically.
So
yeah.
there's no registry for individuals, because what we see is that the one program that I'm familiar with, where they receive culturally competent treatment, the success rate is much, much higher.
I imagine, yeah.
That might be something that there should be a coalition for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I had a discussion with this with one of our community members. She was having that issue with a relative of hers, and we were trying to figure out, okay, obviously what's out there isn't working for our Native American community. So what's out there that's alternative? Unfortunately, a lot of our youth are disconnected because we live the society that we live, and if we can get back to, understanding that we're connected to everything, right? So a lot of times addiction is about not feeling connected to those around you and trying to hide that. And I think it's something that definitely needs to be done, but there hasn't been a real focus on getting something like that. But we do know there's a need. But like with anything, grassroots, money, political power necessary, and that's a lot to deal with. But I think it's definitely important.
Hi. So, we celebrate Thanksgiving, much in the way that we celebrate Christmas without Jesus. We celebrate Thanksgiving without Pilgrims or Indians, Native Americans. Sorry, I'm nervous. What now? Because I didn't know a lot of this. My vague awareness of the bad part of the story is that blankets had smallpox. That's basically all I know, and so I'm very startled, as I knew I would be tonight. What does a more appropriate Thanksgiving celebration look like in a non-Native household? How can we do better, given that we aren't sitting down and telling the Pilgrim story and celebrating that version, really? It's really more about turkey and everybody being in one place at the same time. But how can we be more responsible now with our children? One of mine is a 4th grader. And we'll probably have to build a mission, but which I never thought twice about and now I am.
But you can put little dead Indians around it.
He would probably love that. Not that they're dead, but that it's gory. Anyway, I feel like I can only say things wrong tonight, but I'm a direct descendant of William Bradford, who was the first governor of the Pilgrims, so I don't really know how to feel about that anymore. But I would like to do better. What should we do?
You know, thank you for that, and thank you for your honesty, and please, there's no reason why you should know more necessarily because we aren't taught this stuff, right? And so, I'm sure Des has thoughts on this, but one of the things, for me, one of the most insidious things about Thanksgiving is that, it's this kind of, this moral thing of giving thanks, which I think is beautiful and right and good. Like, we should appreciate what we have. We should be grateful for what we have. And then there's this like sick ideology wrapped over it, right? Where it's all about kind of justifying the powerful oppressing, and celebrating what we have that we took from somebody else and erasing their story. And that it just, it's jarring to me. And so I think, celebrating in a way that is actually about gratitude and kind of humility in the face of our history and acknowledging that history. Acknowledge whose land you're on when you're celebrating, learn a little bit about their history and culture and share it with your kids, and maybe make that a little bit of your family celebration. I mean, we all celebrate that. My family celebrates Thanksgiving. We all celebrate Thanksgiving. My sister brought over a couple pilgrims last Thanksgiving, and I shoved them under the tablecloth. I was like, you brought pilgrims to my house? No offense to your ancestors. I'm guessing Indians all over Oklahoma have pilgrims on their tables. I mean, it's part of American culture that's naturalized as well. So, but I think just being conscious about what we're doing with it is what I would recommend.
Yeah, I think that's important, is sharing the story. I don't, again, the way that we celebrate at home is it's about family. It's about coming together. It's about catching up. It's about arguing with each other because that's what we're going to do after we're done eating, or playing games or anything like that. But I also think it's the same thing with, for people who may celebrate Christmas or the holidays, thinking about giving back. Right, so some people, instead of doing Thanksgiving, they'll go to the Los Angeles mission and help provide dinners for the homeless and stuff like that. But it shouldn't just be on holidays, right? You should be giving thanks every single day to all of those around you, the people, and acknowledging what we're taking, right? So one of the big things with my community and a lot of Native communities is that there's a reciprocity between us and everybody around us and the ancestors and the things that surround us. We can't live without them. They can't live without us. Well, technically, Mother Earth can live without us. But that if we're taking, we're always going to be giving back. We're not going to take too much. And so if you think about it in those terms, when you do your own celebration, is like, what can you do to give back? Whether that's giving voice to my ancestors by acknowledging that you're on their land and that was taken, then great. Or actually doing something physical, going and buying a book and giving it to your 4th grade teacher, or doing something a little so that the true history for all communities can be told.
And I'd like to jump in and let you guys know that I didn't want to put this event on to make you all cancel your dinner plans. That was definitely not the intention. My family gets together and we have a big dinner. I think what's important is to realize the untruths that we are taught about American history. And it's great that we have a multi-generational crowd tonight, because I think it'd be interesting to hear from some of you guys on what you've actually been taught in school or in college, what's been in your curriculum, what untruths have you been taught, about Native history and the real version of American history, not the sanitized version, that makes the genocide and the manifest destiny okay, that validates that. So we wanted to hold this event as a conversation, as a circle, so that you can all take something away from it and bring it to your dinner table, bring it to your family and talk about it with your parents, your kids, your grandkids. So I'd also like to hear from you a piece that you might take away, how you might get the conversation started with your family this Thanksgiving.
I wanted to thank you very much for the evening and just offer up a resource in regards to your comments. I had the honor of getting to do a land acknowledgement last month at a monthly meeting that I've been attending for a couple years now it's a group called Aware LA. It's been around for 15 years, and it's a place where white people gather to prepare themselves to work in solidarity with Black people and people of color and Indigenous people of color to create change. And it's a safe place to come and ask questions and get good answers. It's a multi-generational space, and we have lovely elders there, and a resource. And I go from El Segundo by myself in the car every month to actually 2 meetings, and I'd love to have people in the car with me. It's a great group. And this past Thanksgiving, our homeschool group blew up on Facebook because our moderators shut down an innocent question: how are you guys celebrating Thanksgiving this year with your children? And the moderators shut down the question for fear that it would become too political. And it was devastating to a lot of us that even in a countercultural Southern California-based group, that we couldn't have that conversation. A group of progressive mothers working outside public school education. And I have a lot of great resources that came up from that fallout. And we sat around and read a nice article to begin our Thanksgiving. And it went well.
Thank you for that. And I think it's also important to be conscious about these arguments when you try to raise questions about Thanksgiving, right? So either people accuse you of being too political. Why are you politicizing this holiday, which is a family getting together? You're being so political about it. Or one that I often get is, why can't you just leave the past in the past? So they want the history when it's like the happy version with happy pilgrims, but as soon as you want to talk about the real history, why are you bringing up history? Why don't you just leave it in the past? Can't you get over it, right? It's the same kind of line that we get when we bring up mascots or football team names or other things that are offensive. Why can't you just let it go? So, the thing is, if you start to raise these issues in your own discussions, you may get that kind of pushback from family members, from others, from Facebook moderators who are made uncomfortable by what you're raising. But I think it's important to just, not let those things shut you down. And while we're talking about resources, I just wanted to mention, sorry, this is kind of a tangent, but on a different tangent, but if people are interested in doing land acknowledgement, like if you have events or you're, a gathering and you want to acknowledge, if here in the LA Basin, that you're on Tongva land. We've developed a land acknowledgement statement with members of the Tongva community, and it's available on the AISC website. So it's UCLA, AISC, EDU. I'm sorry, AISC. You think I'd know my own website. AISC, UCLA, EDU. And it's a nice acknowledgement, and it has several Tongva words in it. So you can either give the acknowledgement without the words, or if you want to use the Tongva words, which is nice, I mean, the community members really want to hear the words, to have the words used, you can click on the word and a sound cloud will open with the pronunciation so that you can hear how it sounds, so you can pronounce it properly. So I just wanted you all to know about that. That as a resource if you want to acknowledge the land. Yes, AISC, like from American Indian Studies Center, AISC.ucla.edu. And it'll be right there when you open the page.
So one of the other things I was just thinking about, I was having a conversation with the museum staff that they're going to have an exhibit on food. And so one of the things that you can do is talk about the origins of the food that you're eating for Thanksgiving. So, of course, the turkey is, native to the Americas, and at one time Ben Franklin wanted it to be our government bird, but, we got the eagle instead. Cranberries from New England, potatoes from, South America. So you can talk about a lot of the foods that we eat on Thanksgiving are indigenous in origin, and they were domesticated by indigenous people across the Americas. So that's a little education. So you're acknowledging that we wouldn't have the potato if it weren't for the indigenous populations that, cultivated them. And, there's so many varieties of potatoes. We have our little white ones, but they come in different colors, shapes, and sizes. So that's a way of, again, acknowledging the ancestors and what they've done that we are now privileged to be using and eating.
Hello. I really liked your question when you were struggling for words, because this is, I think, a common thing that we are all struggling for words, for the vocabulary. What is the term we can even use? And I think what we are also looking for is not only an alternative, how can we acknowledge, but we are looking for an image, I feel like sometimes. When you see displays in Trader Joe's, you go in, you see the pilgrim hats, you see the weapons, you go into the classrooms, you see all these displays. And I feel it's not enough to just take the pilgrim hats out. I'm actually looking is there an image which could, a little bit like a reminder that the story is not as simple. It's not that I want to narrow it down to one image, but is there, of course I could take a postcard from this beautiful show, but is there an image instead of the pilgrim hat? And I don't want to cartoonize it, but a little, you sometimes not only harvest, but one step further.
It's hard to imagine what that image would be because we're so diverse. And I think often American Indians get talked about as an ethnic minority in this country, like African American, Asian American. My center is part of the Ethnic Studies Centers, where Asian American, African American, Mexican American, and Native American. But Native Americans are not just an ethnic minority, right? They're originary people, but we're also politically sovereign nations, which is a very different thing than a racial group, right? And so racially and ethnically, we're quite diverse. And so I think any one image would necessarily, and of course what we've had over the course of a couple of centuries is one image. It's the Plains Indian, as Des was saying, with the headdress and people will regularly say to me, I'm sure you guys can imagine this, oh, you don't look Native American. I haven't heard that one before. And what does a Native American look like? Really? You don't look white. How do you respond to it? What is it? So my concern about any one image would be that it would, erase a lot of other potential images.
I think my question is really going into the display in the classrooms. Mm-hmm. So if the displays in the classrooms stick to just the harvest, I still feel that's not enough. It's not enough that the windows are suddenly maybe just taking things out. There's I feel there's something also just a reminder, a...
Heritage Month. It's Native American Heritage Month, which is kind of ironic, I think that would be the symbol, you know.
I was actually thinking about that the other day, and I don't actually know the history of, you know, why, when and why Native Heritage Month got set in HW, the first Bush, right? And I mean, did they set it in November because of Thanksgiving? I don't know. It'd be an interesting thing to look into because that's kind of, yeah, ironic little twist. Well, you got to keep Thanksgiving, but we'll give you the Heritage Month.
No, I understand your question in terms of like how do you decorate a classroom and images and stuff like that, but I do think fall and harvest is important, but it has to be what was on the land. So for instance, the Gabrielino Tonga, we didn't have corn until Europeans brought it. So our harvest is totally different. We had acorns and we had other nuts, walnuts, etc. So, you know, the images for our fall would be something totally different from, you know, a classroom that's in the traditional lands of somebody else that did have corn. Like a lot of people, when they talk about farming in Native communities, they talk about the three sisters, right? The corn, beans, and squash, and they're joined together because they grow well, and you know, you learn about the science and the nitrogen and all that kind of good stuff. But that wasn't, we didn't have that here in California. We didn't have beans, the beans that we think about today. We had mesquite beans and stuff like that in the deserts. So, you know, you would, I think, images of celebrations in harvest and fall needs, you know, can be used, but it was going to have to be very specific to the land that you're on, so that you're not, once again, essentializing and generalizing all of our diverse communities and foodways.
I'm not sure who went up first. Come over here first.
I think taking children's books and looking at the glossing over of, example, even just Squanto, he spoke English. A lot of books, that's the only thing other than he helped the Pilgrims. So the whole thing of delving into the real Squanto, or how did he even get back, or how did he get dropped off in this place, and looking at what was actually mentioned in the kids' books, because in almost all kids' books, it still just mentions he spoke English. So trying to intrigue that mind of what was left out and really delving into like the life of Squanto can have great family discussions, because everybody in this generation just learned that he spoke English and helped the Pilgrims plant and use eel and fertilizer. That's the most he gets. But the intriguing story, or taking other, in my opinion, take Pocahontas and compare, this is what Disney shows and this is, or Columbus, this is what your book shows about Columbus. They traded beads, and then what actually happened with the natives during the Columbus time. I think it's great, inspiring, gets kids thinking. And I don't know what you feel about the Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. If you want to cry at just about every chapter, that would be your book. Also, there's Howard Zinn. He's not necessarily Native American, but when you talk about the real history that we didn't learn, and it just piques your interest, if you take one of his books, The People's History of America, and you look at what you were learned and what it's in that book, it's another just eye-opener, just peeling away the onions.
I've seen lately, mostly online and in like social media spaces, these very detailed maps of overlaying different nations across. And I'm curious if you know if maps like that are available, or the veracity of those maps, or who's print. I was trying to see if I could get one, and it was difficult to even sort of, like the searches were, it just was pretty shallow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually talked a lot about this to the teachers that that participated in that workshop that I was talking about in terms of Tongva history. One of the big things, particularly here in Southern California, is that there was never thick boundary lines within our traditional territories. And a lot of it had to do with, one, in terms of how we lived in the past, you identified yourself from what village you came from. So there was never one overarching Gabrielino Tongva community. You were from a particular village. So for instance, Los Angeles was Yagna, and so you were Yabit person from Ya, which is the name of the village. And so when I show maps, and I'm trying to do this, is that the boundaries are really shared space. So, you know, deep in the heart of Tongva territory, for instance, right here, we're deep in the heart of Tongva territory. But when you start moving toward Long Beach and into Orange County, we start to share boundaries with other communities like the Ahachiman down south. And so a lot of times we were using those areas together because they're our cousins. A lot of our communities weren't allowed to marry people from our own village because we had to marry people from other villages, which included the other tribes around us. So we had familial connections to all of the different tribes. And I like to say the Tongva got around. And they loved each other and the other tribes. And so, you know, when you're in an area where you're not getting food, then you reach out to your relatives in another area and say, I need help. You know, can you send me some food? Remember reciprocity I was talking about? Because in the future, if they need something, then we're going to be able to send some food there. So I have a map where I have, you know, you'll see these anthropological boundaries. Those boundaries that were done by anthropologists are based on what the territories look like at contact. And so those aren't necessarily the case today. So I've done research in the areas of Lakeview in Riverside County, if any of you know where that's at, Ramona Parkway. That area was used by 5 different tribes. It was used by the Kuya, it was used by the Gabrielino, it was used by the Luiseño, and right now all of us say it's ours. But in fact, that was an area that was used by all of us because we all came together, our boundaries, and you know, we would use what we needed to use and stuff like that. So there is no correct map because you have to talk about, okay, what are the boundaries through time? But there are tribes who are making their own maps, and that's the reason why we have Mapping Indigenous LA. So the Tatabatum, which are a tribe that are in northern Los Angeles County and into Antelope Valley, they've actually created their own map that has the names of villages and stuff like that. And in some instances, it overlaps, again, with what we consider Tongva territory, and we're not going to fight them for it because they have families that actually have Tongva members. And so we're not going to say, you can't claim that because you have family members that are from that village. And so it becomes really complicated. So there is no one good map. Someday I will make one. But, you know, you always have to think about where are they getting that information. Like, I think there's one that's out of Canada that somebody is putting together. And they never talked, as far as I know, talked to any Gabrielino Tongva people. And what they have listed is actually incorrect. So you always have to be, like anything, right? Where did they get the references? Who are they talking to? Where are they getting their information?
I live in Topanga Canyon, which is the overlap of Tongva and Chumash territory.
It's Gabrielino.
And people fight.
It's mine.
The name is a Tongva word.
In case any of you didn't know any places that have the NGA or GNA ending is a Gabrielino word. So Topanga,
Rancho
Cucamonga, that end, NGA is, in our language, is the location of, right? So you had the village.
Like place of.
Yeah. Stream between the waters, or, you know, whatever, that kind of stuff. So anytime you see that, you're speaking Gabrielino.
There's a lot of them in LA.
Yeah.
German. That's Tongva.
Yeah, there was actually a couple of villages that are on Palos Verdes. I can't pronounce them. And a lot of what's out there are place names that were recorded by people who didn't necessarily know how to well, we didn't have a written language, so they were trying to do as best as they could in terms of coming up with what the name is. And so one of our community members, Craig Torres, who really has been studying our language, is, I don't want to say recreating, but trying to accurately create words in which how the village is sounding. So he's looking at the root words. So the names of our villages was based on what it was surrounding. So like I say, like the string between two trees or whatever, like that's how we would name things, or you know, the area, the Bay of Smokes, for instance. And so the name of the place would be a descriptor like that. So he's going back and looking at all of these kind of transliterations that all of these non-Tongva speaking people try to come up with, and then going back to what the root of the word is. So for instance, Pimu is the name of Catalina Island, and Pimu actually means breast, mother's milk. And so when you look at how the rest of Southern California Indians looked at the islands, in some instances you have stories that the islands are parts of a human body. And so Catalina becomes like the origin, or mother's milk. That's the breast of a body that is spread out amongst the Channel Islands and things like that. So again, you know, this history is much more interesting than the myths and histories that we're being taught, you know, and it's something that we should strive for.
Just so you know, Tongva Tovanga, which is the traditional Tongva territory, includes not only the LA Basin, but the South Channel Islands. Not sure if we said that.
I own all of California, FYI.
Did you say that you're working on the Catalina Island? There's a historical dig there, or?
Yeah, so starting in 2007, myself, Dr. Wendy Teeter at UCLA, and Karima Kennedy Richardson, who's now staff archaeologist at the Autry and also getting her PhD at UC Riverside, we've been running an archaeology project in collaboration with not only the Tongva community, but also the Catalina Island Conservancy, and trying to document the sites that are on Catalina Island. So there's over 1,000. And a lot of those places haven't been visited in over 40 years, so trying to help the Conservancy identify and then protect those sites that are out there, but also making sure that we can, the Gabrielino Tongva community can reconnect with the island. So because the last Gabrielino Tongva was taken off the island in the 1820s, and we do have community members living there now, you know, we lost a lot of our connections. Catalina Island is sacred to us. The most powerful people lived on Catalina, so if you wanted something done to your enemies, you would go to Catalina and tell them, hey, please, you know, smite my enemies, etc. But the people that lived there could bend trees and calm the waters, and so it's not only sacred to us, but also to a lot of Southern California Indians. So because of colonization and the diaspora, we kind of lost that connection. So not only are we recording our history, but we're also reconnecting. And so for 8 years, we taught an archaeological field school through UCLA and then CSUN to teach students about how Native people see what's on the land. So archaeological sites are not just data, they're actually, you know, the remnants of our ancestors living on the land. And we would bring out some of our community members to teach our students about food. And they would help collect food like cattails and coreopsis and things on the land, and then we would get deer, and they would learn about our traditional foods, and then I'd make them cut up the deer using stone tools that they made and flint knap, because I taught them how to do that. So not only, you know, they're learning about how to be on the land and how our ancestors lived, and how to be healthy in terms of eating traditional foods, but then also bringing our communities in order to, our community members to make contact with the land and just see how beautiful Catalina is. If you guys haven't gone into the interior, like Avalon is Avalon, Avalon's nice. Get, you know, a candy apple from Lloyd's, but if you ever get a chance to take a tour in the interior, it's just so beautiful, and you can kind of think that this is how California used to look like before development. And it's just, you know, it's just an awesome experience. I always go there every year in order to kind of reconnect and get away from distress and remember.
Thank you.
I know it wasn't Catalina, but is there any truth to the Island of the Blue Dolphin? The story?
Yes, so the Island of the Blue Dolphins is a fictionalized novel by Scott Odell, and it talks about a woman who ends up being baptized as Juana Maria. But yes, she was left on the island, and she was rescued years later and ended up being taken to Santa Barbara Mission, which is in Chumash territory. And so when you hear that, you know, she couldn't talk to the people, like they never brought anybody up from San Gabriel Mission or San Fernando Mission who spoke Tongva in order to communicate with her. So there is truth. There's actually, if you go onto YouTube, the Channel Islands, I forget what the foundation is, but if you Google San Nicolas, there is a number of different lectures that have been given at the Channel Island Symposium that talks about the history. And I also believe there was a PBS special that came out not too long ago that talks about the things that happened. Reneé Vanellawith, who's an archaeologist, was doing work on San Nic, San Nic is owned by the US Navy, and so he was doing archaeological field work out there, and they believe they found the cave that Juana Maria lived in. So go to YouTube, and there's a number of different stories, videos that talk about the real history of Juana Maria. Like, I hate using that name, Juana Maria, but we don't know what she called herself. And we actually have a couple of songs that were recorded, or a couple of songs that she passed down to the Chuma people that were living in the mission. The Toki Toki song, we actually sing that, and I won't sing it for you because I'm a horrible singer. But we only have like 3 recorded words from her that was passed down to the Native people that she talked to.
Everyone, our evening is fast drawing to a close, if you can believe it. But I wanted to acknowledge our wonderful speakers, Shannon and Desireé. Thank you so much. If you have any final, well, not final, but maybe some thoughts, ideas to consider before we close out the circle this evening.
I don't want people to feel guilty, right? And I know, some people are sad about the history, but again, that's why I kind of wanted to say, think about honoring the ancestors, both your own as well as those that lived on this land. Don't forget the pain and the misery, but, I don't want to say get over it, but, recognize and then move forward and do something to put positivity into the world.
And don't forget, we're still here. Thank you all so much. It's been an honor to be with you.
And thank you, everyone, tonight for joining us. As I said, this discussion will be available on El Segundo TV soon, so this might be a wonderful resource to share with that 4th grade teacher or a family member or friend. Our education team has worked very closely with Kristen to develop curriculum for this show, MATRIARCHS. It's our first. It is available online for free. If you go to our website, ESMoA.org, look under schools, and the curriculum is right there. And we also worked with El Segundo Library to develop a curriculum. They researched books by Indigenous writers and illustrators. And those books are available to check out, and there's also a bookmark, so pick one up before you leave. It's a great gift, not just for young minds, but older minds as well. And Kristen just told me that 1621, the Thanksgiving book, is now at the library, too. Yeah.
There's also a display of books by Native authors in the children's section of the library. So if you have kids, go on down there, even if you don't. And it corresponds, great, ties in with our Matriarchs exhibit here. And I have many thoughts, but I just really want to thank our speakers again for taking their time and their energy and their thoughts to be with us tonight. It's really important to have these conversations and really start to do better with each generation. I think that, yeah, I'm getting emotional. That's what this exhibit is about, and that's what my goal is to become a good ancestor. And I think that those are the thoughts I want to leave with you tonight is how can each of us become a good ancestor? Chuck Mashke.